Well, Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. Those of you that don't know Ruth, she has been incredibly busy on TV and radio, and so we are so glad that you are here. Perhaps you can start. We had an interesting chat just before we started, and I asked Ruth, like, why land? How did you come to work on this? And maybe you could just give us a little bit of that personal story, but also helping us understand why land is such an important issue and why we have to engage with it.
Great question. So this is a bit personal, and I hadn't actually expected this. But growing up in the 70s and 80s in the Eastern Cape, my mother was an activist, and she was part of what was called then the Surplus People Project. And they were documenting forced removals in the rural areas. It was around the creation of the Ciskei and the Transkei. And I spent a lot of time as a child going out on rural field trips and hanging out with the women, you know, cooking while the men were having meetings and sometimes getting arrested, you know, frankly. So by the 1990s, I was studying politics and thought, well, actually, what is the most important political question in our country? Surely it is the question of land. Surely it's a question of land. And a lot of people who I was working with, who were working on gender and development, were thinking about health and education. And I thought, well, surely a critical question is about who owns the economy? Who owns the economy? Who owns the land? And that's where I think we need to start, because I think that when we talk about land, when the EFF or the ANC talk about land, they're talking about two different things. They're talking about land as sort of an embodiment of the economy. Who owns the economy? But it's also a symbol. It's a symbol of citizenship, of belonging and identity. And I think that we often sort of mix those up.
And so this is something that's been a central question for a long time. And even back in 1994, it was something that the Mandela government put front and center. So what was the approach back in 94, and how successful have those policies been?
So actually the ANC, I would say, the ANC had very little idea about how to deal with land issues in the early 1990s. So the World Bank came in, they had a mission here. The ANC said, okay, we're not going to expropriate land, we're just going to sort of proceed on a market-based process, okay? And of course the ANC didn't have to do that. The ANC chose to adopt a market-based willing buyer, willing seller approach, even though the Constitution gave it the powers to expropriate. So the ANC proceeded quite slowly. And the reality is, and here we are, and I know that we're going to look at a movie that looks at urban restitution, but we've basically spent the last 20 years proceeding very slowly. You know, and a lot of people are angry. A lot of people are really angry with the state. So about 8% of commercial farmland has been transferred. 8% is not a lot in 20 years, and a lot of black people feel like the state is not really taking this seriously.
So why has the pace of reform been so slow? I mean, it's such an evocative issue. So what's held us back?
Well, political choice. I would argue it's not the Constitution that's held us back. It's been a political choice. The state has chosen not to pursue this issue. So there's never been more than 1% of the national budget allocated to land reform. Currently it's sitting at 0.4% of the national budget. So the state has chosen not to invest in this issue. And so my view is that we're at a turning point right now, and this is quite a complex issue. I think that the Constitution has not been the problem, but the fact that the ANC and the EFF have come together in an apparent agreement. I say apparent because I think that they mean different things by this. They've come together in an apparent agreement, and we have now a new process underway in Parliament. Parliament is looking into the property clause. I think it's actually quite a constructive process because it's raising bigger questions, which is why the hell have we not dealt with this before?
Okay, so to hear you say it's a constructive process, I know many people who hear the debates and feel incredibly anxious.
Yeah.
So why do you think it's constructive? How do you see the process playing out?
Yeah.
And maybe you can also just say a little bit about when you talk about the EFF and the ANC and an apparent, I mean, what is it that you think is different here? Because I think often the EFF view gets conflated as the only view. And actually there's quite a lot of nuance in this debate around expropriation without compensation.
So I think that, you know, there's such a huge demand among black people to say, we want our country back. We want our country back. And we want our country back as in, we want our urban properties back, or we want our rural land back. When the EFF says expropriation without compensation, they're talking about a blanket rule. They're saying, this is how it must be for all property. When the ANC says expropriation without compensation, they're saying, when we choose to do so, we want this as one of the tools in our toolbox. So we could buy on the open market, we could negotiate hard, or we can expropriate. And when we expropriate, we can pay compensation to some people, or we can not pay compensation to other people, or we can pay partial compensation. And we're probably going to see this being acted out in the Constitutional Court. So I think that what we're going to see in the next year is a series of test cases going to the Constitutional Court. And for the first time, the Con Court will rule on what is just and equitable compensation. No, since 1996, we've had a clause in the Constitution that says the state can expropriate for land reform purposes. And it was paid just and equitable compensation. And we have never ever had a court case that determines what is just and equitable. How do we weigh up equitably the question of the private interests of the people affected? The person who owns the property, who might have bought it last year at market price, who might have inherited it 100 years ago. How do we weigh that up against the public interest? Should we as the public and as taxpayers pay 100%? Should we pay 50%? Should we pay 0% if it was bought a long time ago and it was subsidized and it's not even being used, it's being held for speculative purposes. So we need to actually develop some muscle, you know. We need to develop some thinking and muscle and policy. I think that that's what's lacking.
And so you think it's quite a constructive, positive kind of road we're about to head down?
Well, who knows? Because I think that if we were to open our eyes and ears and think about the moment that we're in, our new president is under pressure, under unbelievable pressure. And I think that the knives are out to try and bring him down. And this is probably going to be one of the Latin Road issues. So it remains to be seen. But I think that the ruling party, for the first time in more than 20 years, is starting to think about these issues and say, how can we try to deal with the land issue? And not only rural, but urban as well. And I think that that's really significant, and that's what makes me hopeful.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. So can we talk about, because often most people think, oh, it's rural, it's just about farmers, it doesn't affect me, I live in Claremont. I'm fine, so I don't need to engage, but actually it's more complex than that.
Well, of course, and actually, I actually meant to bring a book along, but I didn't get around to it. But there's a very interesting book that I put together with some other people, and it looks at land claims across the country. And one of the chapters deals with land claims in Rondebosch. And it's right here. It's actually about 3 blocks that way and about 4 blocks that way. These are houses that were occupied by black South Africans who were dispossessed, kicked out of their houses, moved off to Mitchell's Plain or Grassy Park. And they still exist there. And they come back and they see those houses. And they see the people who live in those houses. And this is one of the interesting things about land issues, I think, is that it's not just an abstract question of how do we deal with this, but there's also a question of how do we deal with bringing together people who benefited and people who are victims. And I think that that's what we missed in the TRC. The TRC process focused on gross human rights violations, but it didn't bring together people who were beneficiaries together with people who were perpetrators. And so how do we start the conversations? And that's why I thought that the video that I think we're about to watch is very interesting, because it brings to life the voices of people who say, but you live in my house. You live in my house. How do you deal with the fact that you live in my house? And how are we going to go forward? So my view is that we're at a bit of a turning point. Perhaps within the coming year, we could have a bit of clarity from a government position, a state position around land issues. But we're going to have to deal with the messy realities on the ground, nevertheless.
So one of the messy questions, and this may be an unfair question to ask, so you can say pass.
Okay.
How far back do you go? Where do you draw the line? Because in many instances we're talking about multiple evictions and across different generations. So, I mean, what's the thinking out there? What's the current policy in terms of where we draw the line? And yeah.
So what the Constitution says is that those people who are descendants of people who were forcibly removed from land after 1913, which is the date of the Natives Land Act, that those people should be entitled to claim back that land. And now that's very controversial. And the reason why it's controversial is the 1913 cut-off date basically excludes huge parts of the country, because colonialism started in the southwest of the country. It started right here. Okay? So by 1913, most black people didn't have their own land. So in Limpopo and Mpumalanga, huge numbers of people are claiming, but in the southwest of the country, here in the Cape, people can't claim. And so the Khoisan are saying, why on earth should we accept this 1913 cut-off date? We reject it, totally. And we see it as an affront to us as Khoisan people. Okay, so my argument actually is that rather than taking the date backwards, so one view is let's take it back from 1913 to 1652 or something else. Actually, my argument is that we should be engaging around who wants the land, what land do they want, where do they want it, for what do they want it, how can we support them, etc. And that's all possible under the existing constitution. So we don't have to be fixated on the land claims process. There's a broader process of land redistribution. And the minister can make a choice. The minister can make a choice to say, okay, here's a group of people who really want this land. They have a historical connection with it. I can give it to them. So I think that we can step away from that obsession with the 1913 issue. But I do think that it's very understandable that a lot of Khoisan people are very angry about the 1913 cut-off.
So are there examples of successful land reforms elsewhere? Often people will cite Zimbabwe, but I mean, are there other cases that we can look to that would give us reason to be optimistic? And under what conditions?
Okay, great question. I would cite examples like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. So a lot of the Asian big tigers, they're called the Asian tigers, the big growing economies, were built on the basis of land reforms. And what those land reforms did is they took the land that was held by landlords who were extracting rent from people, and they gave the land to the tenants, right? And that is the basis of a lot of the productive economic growth that happened in those countries. So I would say those are very important examples of land reform. In terms of redistributing land from white to black in Africa, Kenya is quite a poor example. Zimbabwe is a complex example. It's a complex example in that for the first 10 years or so after independence, Zimbabwe did very little. They did quite well, but they did very little. Under fast-track land reform, they seized land, and there was a wider economic collapse that was not only about the land issue. So let's be clear that it's not all about the land issue. So I think that our evidence from different countries shows us that redistributing land from big landholders to small-scale farmers under conditions where you give people secure rights can actually be very productive. It's not been tried. And the weird thing, I would say, to South Africans is we've been doing land reform for more than 20 years in South Africa, and we've never been subdividing land. We've been giving big commercial farms to groups of people, but we've never been subdividing farms and saying, okay, you want to be a smallholder farmer, here's a well-located piece of land for you, right next to an urban area. Why have we not been doing that? So I think that we need to reorientate our thinking and come back to the question of well-located land, both urban and rural. And I think that this is going to be a big political issue in the coming year as both ANC and the DA and the EFF in their various metros try to jockey around this issue. But I think that the key issue is people want well-located land. And most people who want land want small parcels of land that's well-located. People want land that is close to a city, close to a town, where they can send their children to school, where they can get access to a clinic, etc. And we're not giving those opportunities. We're saying, okay, a big farm 200 kilometers away. No, that's not what we want. We want targeted land reform. We want a land reform that gives people access to land where they want it. And I think that we're in an exciting moment now, precisely because I think that we're starting to democratize the debate. And people are starting to say, this is what we want.
So last question. What do you think is the role for the church in this process?
Okay. Great. So I have a document here. So please read the document. No, you know, there have been a few church gatherings over the past couple of decades. And there's one here, which is the South African Council of Churches in 2007. And they also met in 1995. So there are various documents where the churches over time have done three things. Firstly, they've acknowledged that the churches have been complicit in land dispossession. Right? And that the churches, and maybe not yours, but a lot of churches have become big landowners. And they've held land on behalf of black people because those people were in areas that were designated for white occupation. So the NGK and the Moravian Church and so on, these churches have had a major role in holding land. They've been complicit in land dispossession. And they've said, okay, we acknowledge this and we want to be part of the solution. But they haven't really. So I think that the churches have been quite silent. My view is that churches haven't really grappled with this. And the question is, what does justice look like for the churches? And what role should they play? And I think it's a bit complicated, perhaps, for a group like yourselves, because perhaps you don't own property. But I think that you can play a role in shaping the narrative. And I think right now, the discussion, the narrative within society is changing very fast. And I think that as a church, you can play a very important role. So the three things that I said in the article that I'm going to share with you is, firstly, the churches were complicit in land dispossession, massively. Secondly, they are abusing their role as custodians of land. Across a lot of the Western Cape, a huge amount of land is being held by churches, and people are tenants of the church. Right? And thirdly, there's the question of what do the churches do now? So as perhaps a non-land holding church, what do? I think you shape the narrative. You're trying to get people to say, land dispossession is a massive issue in our country. The impacts of it are felt all the time by everyone. Whether you're a beneficiary like myself, a beneficiary of land dispossession, whether you're somebody whose life has been impacted by land dispossession, we're all impacted. And how are we going to play that leadership role in changing the conversation? So I think that we need to actually get with it, and the society is going to have to change. You know, we're not going to be the same.
Awesome. Won't you join me in thanking Ruth?